It was a quiet morning at Los Angeles International Airport. The air buzzed with the usual travel chatter, wheels rolling, coffee steaming, flight announcements echoing through the terminals. Steven Seagal moved calmly through the boarding gate, wearing a plain black jacket, sunglasses, and a simple travel bag slung over his shoulder. There was nothing flashy about him, no entourage, no VIP service, just another passenger waiting for his flight to Washington, D.C. At the counter, he greeted the attendant with a polite nod and handed over his boarding pass. "Morning," he said in his low, steady voice. The young gate agent glanced briefly at his ticket, frowned slightly, and tapped a few keys on her monitor. Looks like a system issue. "Sir, can you please step aside for a second?" Steven nodded and stepped back without complaint. Behind him, a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit approached the counter, phone in hand. The attendant's tone instantly brightened. "Good morning, Mr. Riley. We've got your first-class seat ready, 2A, right up front." Steven raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. A moment later, the attendant turned back to him. "Sir, it seems your seat was reassigned. You'll be seated in the last row, 36B. He looked at her calmly. "There must be a mistake," he said evenly. "That seat was booked weeks ago." But the attendant simply smiled, that polite, dismissive kind. "I'm sorry, sir. It's a full flight and we can't make further changes." A few nearby passengers looked up, sensing tension. Steven's height and quiet composure drew attention, but his tone stayed respectful. "I understand," he said softly. "If that's how it has to be." She handed him the new boarding pass, not realizing she'd just sent the Federal Aviation Administration's Director of Flight Safety to the back of the plane. As Steven walked down the jet bridge, passing the luxury of first class for the cramped rows behind, a few travelers exchanged murmurs. "Isn't that?" one whispered. Another shook his head. "Nah, can't be. Why would he be sitting back here?" Steven slid into the narrow last row seat, folded his hands, and gazed out the window. What happened next would make every airline employee on that plane rethink their entire idea of respect. The aircraft door closed with a soft thud, and the cabin lights dimmed to a mellow glow. Passengers were still settling in when Steven Seagal finally adjusted himself into the cramped last row seat beside the lavatory, a far cry from the spacious first-class seat he had originally booked. The hum of conversation filled the cabin. A crying infant somewhere in the middle rows, a businessman complaining about Wi-Fi, the faint scent of coffee drifting from the galley. Steven sat quietly, hands folded, eyes half closed. He wasn't angry, just observant. Years in aviation safety had trained him to notice details. The slightly frayed safety card, the crooked latch on the overhead bin, the nervous shuffle of a new attendant near the rear galley. A few rows ahead, one flight attendant whispered to another, glancing toward him. "That guy looked upset when we changed his seat," she murmured. The other shrugged. "He probably bought economy and tried to sneak up front. Happens all the time." Steven caught part of the comment but didn't react. He'd seen prejudice in many forms: wealth, status, appearance, and had learned that silence could speak louder than anger. The flight began its taxi toward the runway. A steward approached the back row, tray in hand. "Sir, can you make sure your seat back is upright?" Steven nodded. "Of course." The steward hesitated, then added, "And please keep your bag under the seat. We've got limited space here in economy." Again, Steven complied without argument. "Understood." The attendant offered a tight smile and walked away, clearly assuming he was just another difficult passenger made cooperative. As the engines roared and the plane lifted, Steven leaned back slightly and looked around. The cramped space didn't bother him, but the attitude did. Every passenger, he thought, deserved the same courtesy, no matter where they sat. Halfway through the climb, a man across the aisle struck up conversation. He was middle-aged, friendly, curious. "Rough start, huh? I saw the gate thing. You handled that pretty calmly." Steven smiled faintly. "No point losing composure over a mistake." The man chuckled. "You travel for work?" Steven paused, considering. "You could say that. Aviation keeps me busy." "Pilot?" "Something like that," Steven replied, eyes returning to the window. The man laughed, unaware of the truth. "Well, at least you know what you're talking about if something goes wrong up there." The flight attendants began service. First-class meals followed by premium snacks, then basic drinks for the back rows. When the cart reached Steven, the same attendant from before smiled mechanically. "Would you like a small water or pretzels?" "That's fine," Steven said, taking both with a polite nod. As she turned to leave, turbulence shook the cabin slightly. A few passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign blinked on. Steven instinctively steadied the water on his tray and glanced toward the galley. The new attendant from earlier looked uncertain, fumbling with the intercom. Captain, slight turbulence." "We're, securing service now," she stammered. Steven's tone was calm, reassuring. "You'll be fine. Just make sure the trolley wheels are locked." She blinked at him. "Sir, please don't interfere with crew procedures," she said sharply, embarrassment coloring her voice. "I wasn't interfering," Steven replied softly. "Just a suggestion. The latch near your elbow isn't fully locked." The attendant ignored him, pushing the cart into position with unnecessary force, only for it to roll back seconds later when another bump hit. Water bottles rattled, one falling into the aisle. A few passengers laughed nervously. Steven simply leaned forward, caught the runaway bottle before it hit a child's feet, and placed it gently back on the cart. The attendant flushed, muttering, "Thank you," before hurrying away. The man beside Steven shook his head. "You've got patience, I'll give you that." Steven smiled slightly. "Patience keeps planes safe." The man laughed again, not realizing the deeper meaning behind the words. As the turbulence passed, the crew returned to normal operations, but several passengers had noticed the way Steven handled the situation. Quiet, professional, unbothered. He took a slow sip of water, his eyes steady. He wasn't going to expose who he was, not yet. He just waited. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you look or where you sit? Type yes if you've ever faced that kind of bias. What no one knew was that the calm man in the last seat was about to test the airline's professionalism in ways they'd never forget. The IDE flight leveled off at 35,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed slightly and the low hum of engines filled the air. Passengers had settled into their routines: movies, music, naps, and quiet conversations. Steven Seagal sat motionless in his last row seat, calm and observant. The minor turbulence earlier had passed, but something else caught his attention now. A faint flicker from the overhead light panel near the galley door. To most people it was nothing, but to someone trained in aviation safety it wasn't normal. The flight attendant from before was near the galley, clearly nervous. She whispered something to her colleague, who frowned and glanced toward the cockpit. A few seconds later, an alarm chirped softly, short but distinct. Steven leaned slightly forward. "Everything all right up there?" he asked gently. The attendant turned, her expression stiff. "Sir, please remain seated. We have it under control." "I'm sure you do," he said evenly. "But that light near your service panel is an electrical alert. It usually signals a faulty circuit or a latch malfunction." Her eyes widened. "Sir, I'm asking you not to interfere." Steven nodded slowly. "I'm not interfering. I'm suggesting you check the circuit reset under the aft panel before it trips the auxiliary breaker." The attendant hesitated, clearly unsure whether to listen. But her senior, a supervisor in a Navy uniform vest, approached. "Is there a problem?" "This passenger is making comments about aircraft systems," she replied. The supervisor turned to Steven, frowning. "Sir, you're not authorized to advise crew on procedures. Please keep to your seat." Steven looked at him steadily, his deep voice controlled but firm. "If you ignore that light, you might have to divert." "I'd rather you didn't." The supervisor folded his arms. "Sir, do not challenge our crew. You're not qualified to discuss flight operations." That line hung in the air for a moment. A few nearby passengers glanced over, sensing rising tension. Steven's seatmate muttered, "Man, he's just trying to help." The supervisor's tone hardened. "This is your final warning. Sit quietly or I'll have to file a report for interference." Steven's calm gaze didn't waver. "You do what you have to. But if that panel burns out mid-flight, you'll be filling a very different report." The younger attendant looked at the panel again and froze. The small amber light had turned red. Sir," she whispered to the supervisor. "The service panel just went into fault mode." The man's confidence cracked slightly. "That's probably a wiring issue," Steven said quietly. "Exactly what I told you." The supervisor turned back to him, defensive. "We're handling it." Steven gave a small nod. "Then handle it right." He didn't move or raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tone carried authority, not arrogance, just certainty. Within minutes, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical indicator. Nothing to worry about, just routine maintenance checks," passengers murmured. The crew scrambled, checking circuits, confirming system status. Steven stayed silent, his eyes calm as ever. The attendant who had dismissed him earlier finally approached. "Sir," she said quietly, "how did you know about that warning light?" Steven offered a faint smile. "Let's just say I've seen a few cockpits in my life." Her expression softened, curiosity replacing defensiveness. "Are you a pilot?" he simply said, something like that. Meanwhile, the supervisor lingered in the galley, embarrassed but unwilling to admit fault. He radioed the cockpit for confirmation. The captain's voice crackled back. "Issue resolved. Passenger in last row was right. Circuit was tripped." Now several passengers were looking toward the back, whispering, "Wait, what did he say?" One murmured, "That guy fixed it?" "Who is he?" another asked. The crew avoided eye contact with him now, realizing he wasn't the average traveler they'd assumed. Steven reclined slightly, folded his arms, and closed his eyes. His calmness only deepened the mystery. The man beside him chuckled softly. "You really do know your stuff. Bet they feel dumb now." Steven opened one eye. "Ignorance is harmless," he said. "Arrogance isn't." As the plane flew smoothly eastward, whispers spread from row to row. Something about the quiet man in the back wasn't ordinary, and soon they were about to find out exactly who he was. The flight had settled into an easy rhythm again. The earlier tension had faded for most passengers, but not for the crew. In the galley, the supervisor and his team spoke in hushed tones, glancing occasionally toward the back of the plane where Steven Seagal sat, calm and unreadable. "Who is that guy?" one attendant whispered. He knew exactly what was wrong before the captain did. The supervisor shook his head, still defensive. "Could be a retired pilot or a mechanic. Doesn't matter. He shouldn't be commenting on safety systems." But his voice didn't sound convinced. Meanwhile, a few rows ahead, a teenager scrolled through his phone, replaying a video he'd recorded earlier during boarding. He zoomed in on the tall man with the black jacket and ponytail. The teen froze. His eyes widened. "Wait a second," he muttered. "That's Steven Seagal." His mother looked up from her magazine. "Who?" "Mom, Steven Seagal, the actor. He's also an FAA consultant or something. I saw it on a news clip last month. He's into aviation safety." People nearby overheard. The whisper spread like ripples through water. "That guy in the back? Steven Seagal? Are you sure? He doesn't look like a movie star." "No, that's him. I've seen him in interviews. He works with the government now." Within minutes, half the cabin knew. Passengers suddenly turned in their seats, trying to catch a glimpse without being obvious. Some opened their phones, searching his name. The photos matched, unmistakably. In the last row, Steven remained quiet, eyes closed, unaware of the growing recognition around him. A middle-aged woman approached from a few rows up, smiling politely. "Excuse me. I don't mean to bother you, but are you Mr. Seagal?" He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with that calm, measured expression. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. Her eyes lit up. "Oh my goodness, I knew it. I told my son it was you. What are you doing sitting back here?" Steven smiled faintly. "Apparently I was reassigned," the woman laughed nervously. "They made you sit by the lavatory?" He shrugged lightly. "It's just a seat. Doesn't change who I am." But as the words left his mouth, the nearby flight attendant overheard, and her face drained of color. She excused herself and hurried up the aisle, whispering something urgently to the supervisor. The supervisor frowned. "What now?" "That passenger," she hissed. "The tall man in 36B, he's Steven Seagal." "The Steven Seagal? And he's not just an actor anymore. He's part of the FAA's Flight Safety Board." The supervisor froze. "What?" I checked his name on the manifest. "It's him." For a moment, the supervisor didn't move. The realization sank in. The same man they'd dismissed, downgraded, and reprimanded was the one who had authority over their airline safety compliance. His throat went dry. "You're sure?" "Positive." He rubbed his temples. "Oh no." A few passengers in first class were already murmuring about the situation. Word had spread from back to front now, faster than the service cart could roll. Steven, still calm, noticed the sudden change in atmosphere. The same attendant who had scolded him earlier now avoided his eyes completely. The supervisor lingered nearby, nervously straightening his tie, unsure how to approach. Finally, he took a deep breath and walked toward the back. "Mr. Seagal?" he said carefully, his tone suddenly respectful. "Sir, I wasn't aware," Steven interrupted softly. "You weren't supposed to be. I was traveling as a regular passenger." The man nodded awkwardly. "Sir, please accept my apologies for the misunderstanding earlier. If you'd like, we can move you back to your original seat in first class." Steven looked at him, calm but firm. "No, thank you. I'm comfortable here." Passengers nearby watched the exchange in stunned silence. The same man who had been dismissed as unimportant now had the entire crew standing straighter. A woman across the aisle whispered to her husband, "Can you imagine? They downgraded the FAA director. They're finished." Steven simply leaned back again, hands folded, eyes forward. He wasn't interested in revenge or humiliation. He just wanted them to understand. The flight continued smoothly toward Washington, but tension lingered in the air. The crew's smiles had turned stiff, nervous. They knew what was coming next, and it wouldn't be easy. The man they'd demoted to the last row was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The hum of the engines continued, steady and soft. But the atmosphere in the cabin had changed entirely. Every crew member now knew who was sitting in the back row and what authority he carried. Steven Seagal wasn't just an actor to them anymore. He was the director of the Federal Aviation Administration's Flight Safety Division, the man responsible for reviewing airlines' safety protocols, training standards, and compliance reports. The supervisor stood frozen near the galley, his earlier arrogance gone. His mind raced through every mistake of the morning, the tone he used, the dismissive words, the downgrade. Each memory now felt like a ticking clock counting down to an inevitable report. Finally, after a long moment, he straightened his vest and approached Steven's seat again. His voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Seagal, I want to extend my sincerest apology on behalf of the airline and our crew. There was no excuse for how you were treated." Steven looked up from his seat, calm but unreadable. His deep voice filled the space quietly. "You don't have to apologize because of who I am," he said. "You should apologize because of what was done." The supervisor swallowed hard. "You're absolutely right, sir." Steven's gaze softened slightly. "You see, respect shouldn't depend on recognition. Every passenger deserves it, no matter where they sit." The words landed heavily. A few nearby passengers nodded. Even the attendants in the aisle paused to listen. Steven continued, voice steady. "When you judged me by my clothes and my seat, you decided what I was worth before knowing anything about me. That kind of thinking doesn't just create bad service, and it creates bad safety. Because bias clouds judgment, and in aviation, poor judgment can cost lives." The supervisor nodded rapidly, his face pale. "I understand, sir. You're absolutely right. I hope you do," Steven said quietly. "Because one day someone else will sit here. An older woman, a tired worker, someone without a name you recognize. And she'll deserve your respect too." There was silence. Even the steady hum of the engine seemed distant for a moment. Then Steven leaned back, his tone softening. "I'm not here to make anyone lose their job. I'm here to remind people what professionalism looks like." The words cut through the tension like clean air. The passengers who had been watching began to clap, softly at first, then growing louder. A few smiles spread through the cabin. Even those who hadn't known what was happening could feel the weight of the moment. Steven nodded politely to the passengers, but his eyes stayed on the supervisor. "Now," he said calmly, "I'd appreciate if you checked that galley circuit one more time. It's still showing partial fault on your status screen." The supervisor blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir." Right away. As the crew moved to check, one attendant, the young woman who had earlier scolded him, approached, visibly nervous. "Mr. Seagal," she began softly, "I'm truly sorry for how I spoke to you. I was out of line." Steven regarded her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Apology accepted. Learn from it. That's how good crews become great ones. Tears welled slightly in her eyes as she nodded. "Thank you, sir." The man seated next to Steven smiled. "You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen. Most people would have exploded." Steven gave a small, knowing smile. "Power isn't about raising your voice. It's about knowing when you don't have to." From the front of the cabin, the captain himself appeared. He was tall, dignified, and clearly aware of the situation. Approaching Steven, he said respectfully, "Mr. Seagal, it's an honor to have you aboard. My crew briefed me. I'd like to personally apologize for what happened today." Steven nodded. "Captain, thank you. I appreciate your professionalism. Just make sure your people understand. Respect should be standard, not situational." The captain nodded solemnly. Message received. The rest of the flight continued in near silence. The tension had lifted, replaced by quiet reflection. Steven looked out the window at the clouds rolling beneath the wings. Serene, endless, balanced. Exactly how he believed authority should be used. Not to dominate, but to guide. "Respect isn't about rank," he murmured softly. "It's about how you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you." Passengers nearby heard the line, and it stayed with them long after the plane landed. The sun had begun to dip beneath the clouds as the plane started its descent toward Washington, D.C. The atmosphere inside was still subdued, a quiet mix of embarrassment, awe, and respect. Every member of the crew now moved with deliberate politeness, each action precise and cautious. Steven Seagal sat in the same cramped seat he'd been assigned hours earlier, still calm, still composed. He had refused every offer to move forward. To him, staying put wasn't about pride. It was about principle. As the wheels touched down and the engines roared in reverse thrust, passengers began to applaud softly, a sign of relief and closure. But this time the applause wasn't for the landing. It was for him. The captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington, D.C. We'll be taxiing shortly. On behalf of our crew, we'd like to thank you for your patience and extend special appreciation to Mr. Steven Seagal for his professionalism today." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers turned, some clapping quietly, others simply smiling in respect. The supervisor in the navy vest approached again, visibly shaken but trying to keep his composure. "Mr. Seagal," he said softly, "I've already filed an internal report about what happened. I assure you the incident will be reviewed by our management." Steven nodded slightly. "That's good. Make sure it's not just paperwork. Training and attitude start on the ground, not in the sky." The man nodded earnestly. "Understood, sir. You have my word." As the plane rolled to a stop, the flight attendants stood by the exits offering polite goodbyes. But none could meet Steven's eyes without a mix of guilt and admiration. When the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers began to stand, gathering bags from the overhead bins. The man who had sat beside Steven turned to him and said, "I'll never forget this flight, sir. The way you handled all that, it says a lot." Steven gave a small nod, almost like a bow. Sometimes the lesson has to be lived, not taught. As he waited his turn to deplane, the young attendant who'd scolded him earlier approached again. Her eyes were moist but determined. "Mr. Seagal, before you go, thank you. You didn't embarrass us when you easily could have." He gave her a calm, reassuring look. "Everyone deserves the chance to grow. Just remember that when the roles are reversed." She nodded gratefully. When Steven finally stepped out into the jet bridge, 2 airport officials were waiting, one in a suit with an airline badge, the other in a dark blue FAA liaison uniform. The moment they saw him, they straightened immediately. Director Seagal, the FAA liaison, greeted him with respect. "We were informed mid-flight about the situation. Are you all right, sir?" Steven nodded. "I'm fine. No harm done. Just some lessons learned, I hope." The airline manager stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Seagal, I'd like to personally apologize on behalf of our entire airline. We take this very seriously. The staff involved will be debriefed and retrained immediately." Steven looked at him steadily. "Good. But make sure that retraining isn't just about customer service, Mao. Make it about awareness. People in uniform should see humanity first, not hierarchy." The manager nodded quickly. "Absolutely, sir." He turned to leave but paused, glancing back toward the plane. The same supervisor now stood at the door, watching him with visible regret. Their eyes met for a brief second. No anger, no resentment. Just understanding. Steven gave him a small nod before walking away. Outside, the late afternoon light bathed the tarmac in gold. The FAA liaison walked beside him.
"Sir, do you want me to initiate a formal inquiry?"
Steven shook his head. "Not yet. Let them handle it internally. Sometimes a quiet lesson lasts longer than a public punishment. The liaison smiled faintly. You really live by what you preach, don't you? Steven glanced toward the setting sun. In this business, respect is the foundation of safety. When people start treating others with dignity, the rest of the system follows. He reached the terminal exit, stopped for a moment and looked back at the plane, the same one where he'd been sent to the last row. What began as humiliation had turned into something far greater, a wake-up call for everyone on board. Do you think the airline staff should be suspended for how they treated him, or is an apology enough? Share your opinion in the comments below. As Steven disappeared into the crowd of arriving passengers, the whispers followed him, not the gossip of celebrity, but the quiet respect earned only by those who lead with humility. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Clips from passengers' cell phone recordings filled social media feeds, from TikTok to X, Twitter, from Instagram Reels to YouTube Shorts. The footage showed the tense exchange, the supervisor's condescending tone, and Steven Seagal's calm, composed response. But what truly went viral wasn't the confrontation. It was the moment Steven said quietly, "Respect shouldn't depend on recognition." That single line echoed across millions of screens. People stitched, duetted, and reposted it with captions like, "This is what real leadership looks like," and "Seagal didn't need to shout. His calm said everything." By noon, Steven Seagal and Respect First were trending worldwide. News anchors picked it up. Talk shows debated it. Even aviation podcasts and professional pilot forums began discussing the deeper meaning behind it. How bias and arrogance can endanger both service and safety. CNN ran the headline, "FAA Director Steven Seagal faces profiling by airline crew, responds with class." Fox News aired a segment titled, "Humility at 30,000 feet, How Steven Seagal Turned a Flight Incident into a Leadership Lesson." Meanwhile, aviation blogs broke down the incident from a technical standpoint, pointing out that Seagal's calm tone likely prevented an onboard escalation that could have turned dangerous. The airline involved, facing enormous public pressure, released a formal statement. "We deeply regret the incident involving FAA Director Steven Seagal. We are conducting a full internal review and recommitting to training programs that reinforce equality, professionalism, and respect for all passengers." The statement was posted on every platform, but it was Seagal's own response that won people's hearts. That evening, Seagal posted a short video message from his home office. His tone was steady, his words deliberate. "I appreciate the messages of support, but this isn't about me. It's about what happens every day to people who aren't recognized. The only difference this time is that someone recorded it. If you work in aviation or in any service, remember, every person you meet has a story, a struggle, and a dignity that deserves respect. When we forget that, we lose what makes us human." Within hours, the video gained 12 million views. Comments poured in from flight attendants, airport staff, and passengers alike, all sharing stories of prejudice, misunderstanding, or moments where a little empathy could have changed everything. Inside airline headquarters, the fallout was serious. The crew involved were temporarily suspended for review, but instead of punishment, Seagal personally suggested a better outcome: retraining and mentorship under FAA supervision. He told the airline CEO, "Don't destroy their careers, teach them how to be better." That decision sparked another wave of admiration. Journalists wrote that it was a masterclass in leadership through grace. Soon after, the FAA announced a new initiative called Project Horizon, a joint training campaign across U.S. airlines promoting empathy, equality, and passenger respect. At the launch, Seagal gave a short address. Standing at a podium before dozens of pilots and executives, he said, "Air travel connects humanity. It should never divide it. When we fly above the clouds, we leave the ground, but we shouldn't leave our morals there too." The audience stood in applause. Internationally, the story reached every corner. In Manila, news stations proudly replayed the clip, calling him the People's Director. In Europe, aviation academies added segments about cultural sensitivity and passenger respect into their training modules, directly inspired by the Seagal incident. Even passengers began noticing small changes. Warmer greetings, genuine smiles, a little extra care. The quiet revolution of respect had begun. all because one man refused to lose his composure when others lost theirs. Weeks later, when the noise had faded, Seagal was asked by a journalist if he was angry about what happened. He smiled slightly and replied, "Anger changes nothing. Example changes everything." That line became another viral quote, printed on shirts, posters, and even training center walls. The world didn't just remember what happened. They remembered how it happened. The flight that began with humiliation ended with transformation, not just for the airline, but for anyone who ever forgot that kindness is free. If you believe respect should always come before recognition, type respect in the comments.